We're little more than a month away from the first of the Republican primaries for the 2012 presidential election, and the race seems to be as fluid as ever. In recent weeks, this political race has been defined by scandal and embarrassing moments as much as policy.
The third agency of government, yeah. I would do away with the education, commerce, and let's see, I can't. The third one I can't, sorry. Oops.
With me to take a deeper look at some of the top Republican candidates in the field is Richard McGregor, the FT's Washington bureau chief. So why don't we start off with Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney has led the polls from the beginning of this race, and despite significant missteps by a lot of his major competition, he hasn't been able to kind of pull away from the field. Why do you think that is?
Well, that's the big $64 million question of the campaign. By any measure, he's an accomplished candidate. He's a very successful businessman. He was governor of Massachusetts. He's just about won every single of the many Republican debates. He's articulate, he looks good, he looks presidential.
Europe is able to take care of their own problems. We don't want to step in and try and bail out their banks and bail out their governments. They have the capacity to deal with that themselves.
But he's somehow not trusted by a Republican base which has shifted to the right because they worry he's a flip-flopper. He doesn't have a set of core beliefs. There may be on the margin some worry about the fact that he's a Mormon. They just think he might be a bit of a closet liberal with a few characteristics they don't like, and it's starting to get a little bit worrying for Mr. Romney. He can't get above 25%.
And until recently, his most prominent challenger was Herman Cain, the businessman with no elected political experience up until this point.
Well, his campaign is on the way down, but you know, let's face it, nobody ever saw it coming up in the first place, so that's pretty interesting and surprising. Mr. Cain's, I think, won such support because of the simplicity of his pitch, 999, his tax policy, which people could easily understand, and it was presented by somebody who was a very authentic, real-life character, and I think that's what got him to the top. Now he's sort of reached 25% or so. He's on his way down. The interesting thing is, where does his support, when it breaks up and disappears, where does it go? Does it go to Mr. Romney, or does it go to perhaps Newt Gingrich, who's the man of the moment as we're speaking?
First of all, I think Ben Bernanke's a large part of the problem and ought to be fired as rapidly as possible.
Mr. Gingrich's campaign imploded about 4 or 5 months ago when all of his campaign staff resigned. He hasn't had any money to spend on advertising, virtually no ground staff, but because there's been multiple Republican debates, he's basically got free airtime, and he's managed it very well. He's very articulate, he has lots of ideas, he has rat cunning, and he's ruthless. He's quite willing to attack the so-called mainstream media, which wins him lots of points. You know, he's been all over the place on lots of issues, but he still does come across in many respects as a genuine core conservative. And that seems to be really helping him right now, and I think Mr. Romney would have to be starting to get very worried about that.
This is the most volatile race of my lifetime.
And of course, Gingrich, compared to some of the other candidates, has not had as much controversy surrounding his campaign. He certainly has some skeletons in his closet.
Well, Mr. Gingrich has got a long record in public life, a lot of controversy behind him, including personal and political, but that does not seem to have affected him so far. But, you know, in the last few weeks, there's been even more that's coming out of the closet. For example, he received 1.6 to 1.8 million lobbying for Freddie Mac, which had to be bailed out by the federal government under George W. Bush. Cost the US taxpayers billions of dollars. He said he was, only advising them as an historian. I think people disagree with that. He also advised health companies. He appears to be a very compromised figure. And I guess the question is whether all those lobbying efforts and the long trail of contradictions in public life is going to catch up with him eventually and puncture his support.
And one of the first major challengers to Mr. Romney was Rick Perry, the governor of Texas. However, he seemed to have fallen off the map a little bit recently. I mean, where is he right now? He's
way down and looks to have no chance of going back up again. One should never say never in this race, but it was quite an incredible implosion because he shot to the top of the approval ratings amongst the candidates, but then made a statement which angered people about immigration. and then he's made serial sort of large and small errors on the stump and in the debates.
Commerce, education, and the, what's the third one there?
Department of Energy. You know, we've all lost our train of thought before, but not many have done it on national TV. Now, if you want a slick debater, I'm obviously not your guy. But if you want a clean house in Washington with a balanced budget amendment, a flat tax, and a part-time Congress, I'm your man. I'm Rick Perry. What's that line again? I'm Rick Perry, and I approve of this message.
In addition to these candidates who've been kind of grabbing most of the attention on the headlines, there's also candidates such as John Huntsman, who has an enormous amount of both domestic and foreign policy experience. However, he hasn't been able to really capture the electorate's imagination. So where does he stand?
He has an enormously impressive CV. He's been an ambassador in Singapore and also in China. The latter hurt him, of course, because he was serving Barack Obama in that post. But he was governor of Utah. He's got a record in business. He just seems to be too moderate, too centrist for the present Republican Party.
Our biggest problem is right here at home, and you can see it on every street corner. It's called joblessness.
I think he's hoping that he can make an impact in New Hampshire, which is pretty moderate and also allows independents to vote in Republican primaries. So that's his best chance to make an impact there. If he doesn't, I think he'll be bowing out gracefully.
And on the other side of the coin, we have Ron Paul, who has never been accused of being too moderate by anybody, but he's also been surprisingly successful in some of these polls. So, I mean, where does someone like him stand?
Well, Ron Paul, you know, is never going to be the candidate, but he's on the libertarian right, if you like. But he has a genuine following, which means he gets, you know, a sort of base support level up to 10 to 13%, perhaps more in Iowa. You know, you wouldn't want to write him off there.
I have a personal belief that you never have to give up liberty for security. You can still provide security without sacrifice.
What's interesting about Ron Paul is whether he decides he might like to be, you know, have a third party candidacy once he bows out of the Republican race. I mean, he gets money. He can probably get on the ballot through one of these organizations trying to set it up. He could perhaps try and do it himself. It's expensive. You just wouldn't want to rule him out if too many people think Romney is too centrist, or whomever is chosen is too centrist. It's very volatile at the moment, the economy, politics, and Ron Paul is one person who's talked about as a possibility as an outlier for a third-party candidacy.
I'm sure the rest of the Republican field wouldn't be too happy about that, but of course, as you said, this is a very fluid moment in American politics, so we'll certainly be watching it. And you can follow the rest of this story on FT.com.